Our second class in the Sword of Manjushri, how we're working with cultivating, we called it stainless wisdom, which is ideally the perfect wisdom of emptiness. So let's go ahead and start tonight with our prayers. I think Bob, as the host, our co-host, will put that up on the screen. Maybe tonight we won't do the Heart Sutra. I'm just feeling like maybe, it was nice to do it at the beginning of the course, so maybe we do it at the end, but I don't know that we need to do it every night. But maybe we'll just start with the mandala offering and then go on to the refuge and bodhicitta prayer.
Okay.
And the Heart Sutra is wonderful to do all the time, but does take a little bit more time. And since I want to make sure I cover everything in the sessions that we have, I think maybe we'll again go to the mandala offering. Oh,
Do you
wait.
want to
Oh,
do
yeah. Let's do
prayer?
the praise. Let's do the praise to Manjushri. Why not? That's a little bit shorter. So again, those of you, I think most of you were here last Wednesday, but there is a section where we recite the mantra of Manjushri, Omarapatsana. And so we'll recite that 21 times, and then we'll do the D syllable. You said to do it 108 times. So I'll just do the best that you can in doing that, and try to do that all in one breath. And then at the very end of the breath, swallow kind of bringing that energy of that mantra down into your heart to help you to realize emptiness. So again, we can visualize our own guru in the form of Manjushri, this orange being that has a light body, holding a sword in his right hand, a lotus in his left that has a text, the Perfection of Wisdom Sutra, on that lotus to his left side. Sorry, it's his right hand holding the sword and his left holding the lotus. I think I may have said that wrong earlier. But again, don't worry too much about the visualization. Just try to invoke the spirit of all these holy beings so we can achieve this stainless wisdom. Homage to my Lama and protector, Venerable Manjushri, who holds at his heart a scripture symbolic of his seeing all as it is, whose pure genius shines like the sun unclouded by the two obscurations, who, with compassion like a father for his only child, teaches with 60-fold eloquence all beings imprisoned in cyclic existence, groping in the darkness of ignorance and overwhelmed by suffering. You, whose thunder-like proclamation of the perfection of wisdom arouses us from the stupor of our afflictions and frees us from the iron chains of karma, who wields wisdom's sword, vanquishing the darkness of ignorance, hewing down our every sprout of suffering. You who are primordially pure, gone to the end of the 10 grounds, complete embodiment of every excellence, whose princely body is graced with the 112 adornments, O Manjushri, to you I bow, dispel the darkness of my mind. Omarapatsanadi, 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 Omarapatsanadi. With the brilliance of your wisdom, O compassionate one, illuminate the darkness of my mind's confusion. Grant me the light of self-assured intelligence, that I may see into the Buddha's words and the texts that explain them. So then we'll do the short mandala offering. We'll just do this in English. Again, you can visualize the entire phenomenal world transformed into a beautiful paradise, everything absolutely pure and in that state eternally. And we're just making this vast pure offering to all of our gurus and all the Buddhas, holy beings, so that we can receive their blessings and again achieve this perfect wisdom of emptiness, as well as the entire path to enlightenment. This ground, anointed with perfume, strewn with flowers, adorned with Mount Meru, 4 continents, the sun and the moon. I imagine this as a Buddha field and offer it. May all living beings enjoy this pure land. Idam Guru Ratna Mandalakam Niryatayami. And then refuge and bodhicitta. We'll do this once in English, twice in the Tibetan, renewing that sense of safe direction we find in the 3 jewels in the first 2 lines, and then cultivating the motivation of bodhicitta in the last 2 lines. I go for refuge until I am enlightened to the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Supreme Assembly. By the merits I create through listening to the Dharma, may I become a Buddha in order to benefit all sentient beings. Sangye chodang soki choknam la jangchu bardu dakni kyabsu chi daki chunyan gi pe sonam gi dola penchu sangye drupar shog sangye chodang soki choknam la jangchu bardu dakni kyabsu chi Daki Chanyan Gipe Sanam Gi Dola Panchir Sangye Drupar Shog. Okay, good. Thank you, Bob. Let's go ahead and do a short meditation before we begin. Give ourselves a chance to focus the mind a bit, let go of whatever distractions we might have from the day. And then on the basis of that, we'll set our motivation together, refresh this mind of bodhicitta. So just do whatever meditation you find suitable to work with the breath. If you need a suggestion, as usual, I suggest working with the area around the nostrils where you feel the air coming in and out, creating that very subtle sensation in that area. And just tune into that and make that your object of meditation. But whatever way we're working with the breath, we want to pay attention and make sure that the mind hasn't wandered away or gotten sleepy or whatever is going on. If that does happen, when we check in and we see that we've lost the breath, then let go of whatever it was that distracted you and bring your mind back to the breath. So I'll ring the bowl to begin a few minutes of silent meditation. And then, as I said, I'll lead you in setting motivation. So to set our motivation tonight, I thought I would share one of the verses that we looked at in the first class last week. This is from the Sutra of Questions Posed by Rashtrapala. Because they don't know the meaning of shunyata or nirvana, beings are forced to wander in samsara. Because Buddha has such great compassion for them, he leads them by using numerous reasons and methods. So recall what we discussed last week, that the reason why we ourselves, as well as all beings in samsara, are in that state, being under the control of their karma and delusions, is because of the root delusion. The delusion of ignorance, specifically the ignorance that does not understand emptiness, that clings to things as inherently existent, particularly the I, the self, the person. And recall the Buddha's compassion in giving us these teachings that have been practiced and elaborated upon over all these centuries by all the great masters of India and Tibet, as well as other places where the Dharma flourished. All due to the compassion of the Buddha, the wisdom that he formed in his own mind, that he then imparted to us in the Perfection of Wisdom Sutras, and again, all of what followed in terms of the commentaries and other texts that elucidate the meaning of those profound sutras. So with these thoughts, we recognize that we are in the ideal position to address the suffering of ourselves in the world, because we have met with these teachings. We have met with qualified masters in our lives who can convey these teachings purely. And we should feel amazing good fortune at having attained all of this, created through the force of our own good actions of the past, our own study, our own reflection and meditation on these topics have led us to be right here, right now, able to access these teachings. And the best use of them then is to help all beings to know nirvana, to develop the wisdom of emptiness, shunyata, so they can be free from their suffering as well, and moreover can develop themselves fully into the state of Buddhahood. But to do this, of course, we have to become enlightened ourselves. We have to first cultivate this wisdom within our own minds, and eventually be rid of the ignorance, the wrong view of things as inherently existent, and develop the correct view all the way to the point of direct realization, direct perception of emptiness. So I think that we're here to engage once more tonight in this exploration of this topic of wisdom and developing the realization of emptiness so that we can accomplish that goal, achieving Buddhahood and then helping all beings to know this, driven by the same compassion that the Buddha was driven by, that caused him to reveal this profound perfection of wisdom to this world. Okay, wonderful. So hopefully each of you do have a copy of the text. Again, it's at the link at our website if you did need to retrieve it, and can print it out as a little booklet. I even did send Mary the little cover if you wanted to put a little cover on yours like I've done for mine, and little booklet. So last time we went through the homage, which again was just setting the stage for looking at what the Buddha's real intention was, which was to help us to relinquish all views, all erroneous ways of looking at things, particularly the view that holds things to be inherently existent, again, which is what the wisdom of emptiness is the direct antidote to. So we went on to the first topic, which we were about part of the way through, maybe about half of the way through, looking at why we need to realize emptiness. And so again, in the first verse of chapter 9 of Shantideva's text, we see that that's the chapter on the perfection of wisdom. In that profound text, it says, the Muni taught all these branches for the purpose of wisdom. therefore those who desire to pacify suffering should generate wisdom. So we need wisdom in order to pacify our own suffering, in order to help others to pacify theirs. And then we went on to talk about the different levels of wisdom, the 3 types of wisdom. We talked about the need to cultivate wisdom as a way to help us to move away from our wrong consciousness, our wrong views, through the stages of doubt, to a correct assumption, to an inferential, understanding or cognition of things, and then finally a direct realization of emptiness. It's a non-conceptual mind that is developed in yogic practice and meditative practice. So this is the whole purpose of this, is to help us on our way to achieving those realizations, which hopefully we can achieve before too long. The one that I just read from for the motivation was that the next quote that we had, just looking at the idea that, again, the Buddha taught all of this, gave us all these many different reasonings, methods to realize emptiness. Hopefully tonight we'll get into the first reasoning, the reasoning of dependent arising, which is in the next section, examining what exists and what doesn't exist. I'm hoping we'll touch on that. And then we'll go through a number of other reasonings in the remainder of this course that help us to come at emptiness from a variety of angles. Remember, there was that one quote, I think it was in last week's, maybe it's coming tonight, but the idea is we have to see emptiness and use many different techniques to get at it. To just use one technique might not be the most effective way. Plus, we also want to be able to explain emptiness to others. And not everybody is going to be using the same technique or have the inclination towards the same technique. Then we looked at 2 verses from Arya Deva's 400 stanzas that were at the top of page 2 of the booklet. The idea that even a doubt about things existing in the way that they are held to by this ignorance, that we can remove that we can go contrary to that. Even just a doubt that that can be defeated through our wisdom, that already tears to tatters worldly existence. It begins to shake the rafters, in a sense, moving us in the proper direction away from our wrong consciousness towards that wisdom. And then finally, the last verse that we looked at was this idea that everything that we have that is deluded, and even those positive states of mind that we often have, are rooted in ignorance, because ignorance is the root of samsara. But it's the same way that our tactile sense pervades the entire body, so that all of our other sense conscious or sense powers are embedded within the body. In the same way, confusion is present in all of our delusions. But as I said, even in our positive states of mind currently. And recall the analogy that I used of the tree. And the roots of the tree are the ignorance that we have, and there are sort of 2 sides of the tree, maybe a third side if you can consider neutral states of mind, but they're usually not discussed so much. We usually have the more positive states of mind that lead us on a virtuous path, that cause us to have good rebirths and good experiences within samsara. The fruit of all of those actions and states of mind are the positive things we experience, whereas we have the negative, the non-virtuous states of mind that actually lead to the opposite results. We end up having a lot more suffering, problems, lower rebirths, all those sorts of things. That's the fruit of those states of mind and the actions that they motivate. So confusion is at the root of all of this. Confusion pervades all of those states of mind. And if we ever want to be free of conditioned existence, even though we can gain lots of good rebirths within conditioned existence and have relatively minor suffering, we still are in cyclic existence. It's an unsatisfactory state. So in order to overcome all of our disturbing emotions, as well as to overcome the entire tree of samsara, we have to become free of that confusion, that ignorance. So that's where we were last week. I don't know if there were any questions from last week. I didn't see any in terms of anyone writing to me, but any questions before we go on? Anything that you came to you after last week that you'd like to ask? Okay. Well, again, keep in mind that if you do have questions that come up and you don't want to forget them, because I probably will talk for close to an hour now, maybe not quite an hour, we'll see. But then if you do have questions that come up during that, then just put them in the chat box and Bob will make sure that I address those or what have you. So just put them out there for everyone, or you can direct them specifically to Bob, who is the host for tonight, and he'll manage those. So let's go into the slideshow that I put together for tonight. I'm picking it up exactly where we left off in terms of the very next quote that is on the second half of page 2. This comes from the commentary on the Compendium of Valid Cognition, the Pramanavartika by Dharmakirti. And this is a quote that comes from Lama Tsongkhapa's great treatise, the Lamrim Chenmo. It says, without negating the object of this conception of self, it is impossible to eliminate it. This is speaking to how we can actually get rid of our misconception, our ignorance, our confusion that was spoken of previously, is to negate the object of it, what it is believing in, what it is adhering to, apprehending. I mean, it's not a valid cognition. It's not a valid state of mind. It's a wrong consciousness. So it is adhering to something that is erroneous, that can be negated. And we're going to talk about that in some of the commentary I'm going to share with you. So then he says, it's in reaction to good qualities and faults, there is attachment, hostility, and so forth. So in reaction to the good things that we see, we get attachment, all the pleasant things, delightful things, the faulty, erroneous kind of disturbing stuff that we see that causes unpleasant feelings. We have hostility. We have all these various things arising in reaction to the things that we experience, which again, all of those, as we just saw in the previous verse from Arya Deva, are rooted in confusion. So he says, you eliminate them by not seeing their objects as real. You know, those objects that we see as pleasant, as delightful, as having good qualities, those that we see that are, you know, unpleasurable, having that aversion or anger or hatred, moving away from them. You know, we see those objects as real. And we're going to discuss what we mean by that real tonight. But the idea is that this is how we get rid of those, is by we see that the object that they are clinging to, that they are working with, that they are apprehending, is not real. It's a false mind. It is a wrong awareness, again, as we saw last week. So rather than by purifying the external object of attachment, this is what we do. We eliminate them by getting rid of the object that they're adhering to, the thought, the way that they are looking at them. You know, the external object, we don't get rid of its pleasurable aspects or its unpleasurable aspects in order to get rid of our attachment or anger or aversion, respectively. Instead, we get rid of the object that we are clinging to at that time, seeing that as real. So here I've shared a few things. First is that quote, again, comes from the Lamrim Chenmo. So I went to Geshe Sopa's, his commentary on the Lamrim Chenmo, Steps on the Path to Enlightenment. The 5th volume is the volume on insight, on the special insight into emptiness that we need to cultivate. And so he says here, the yogi sees with a mind of wisdom that all his mental afflictions and contaminated karma arise from what is called in this translation the egoistic view. You know, that self-grasping, that adherence to the self is real, the person is real, the I is real. He understands that this distorted view wrongly grasps the self as its object, this self that is, again, embellished with inherent existence, that is held to be existing on its own side and what have you. He knows that by negating the object held by this view, the view itself will dissolve. So this is kind of the magic of what we're working with here. We're looking at these wrong consciousnesses that are clinging to an erroneous object. And the concept is that if we can negate the object that it is clinging to, then we negate the view of that object as real, the view of that object as something that exists. There's going to be an analogy that's shared shortly that has to do with the rope snake analogy that many of you are familiar with, which will come up again a little bit later in this course. But the one that I often use when I talk about emptiness is a child who is convinced that there's a monster in their room. You know, say this is a young girl she saw a horror movie with her parents by mistake or something. And so she becomes convinced that there's a monster in her room and she can't get to bed at night because she's living with the ignorance that is clinging to a real monster in the room. Well, how would you get this young girl to sleep well at night and to be rid of that misconception? You have to show her that there's no monster in the room, right? Because what that mind of fear and ignorance is clinging to is a real monster in the room. So before the little girl goes to bed, you have to, you know, put on all the lights in the room and get a big flashlight, and you show under the bed and in the closet and behind the dresser and any place there might be a monster. You shine light there so that she can see the absence of the monster in the room. And then hopefully, after you do this enough times, maybe one time won't be enough, she finally gets free of her fear because she comes to the wisdom that realizes there's no monster in the room. We're kind of all the same in terms of our belief in things being real to the degree that this ignorance is adhering to them. And we believe in that reality so much. And that is the basis for why we have conflict with others, why we have this craving and desire, why we have jealousy, why we have pride, etc. All these things are arising on the basis of a mistaken view of a real I and a real you and a real everything. If we get rid of that, just like we remove the idea of there being a real monster, then the view disappears, the view of that, because there's nothing that that view is adhering to any longer. That erroneous view is gotten rid of. It is negated by virtue of negating what it is clinging to. So often we even do talk about two objects of negation. One which doesn't exist, which is the real I or the real you or the real whatever that we're clinging to. And the other that does exist is the ignorance we have in our own minds that is clinging to that false sense. How do we get rid of this ignorance that does exist? Is by getting rid of the object it clings to, which doesn't exist. By negating that, we end up getting rid of the ignorance in our own minds. Just like by negating the reality of a monster in the room, you get rid of the fear that is clinging to the idea of there being a real monster there. So this is the idea that is being presented here, is that we have to actually go through a process of negating the object of that view in order to negate the view itself. As it says there, by negating the object held by this view, the view itself will dissolve. It will no longer have any ground to stand on, especially when we realize that at a very deep level, which, as I said, is what we are trying to do in our gradual movement from a wrong awareness all the way to the direct perception of emptiness. So the yogi tries to negate the object wrongly grasped by this view. The egoistic view holds the self to be inherently existent. This is what we're going to get into in the next section, is kind of examining what we mean by this idea of inherent existence, even though the self is not, even though all phenomena are not inherently existent. This view holds to the self or to any phenomenon to have that quality. The held object of this view is the inherently existent self, and that does not exist at all. Just like the held object of the girl's fear, the young girl's fear, is a monster in the room, a real monster. And that real monster does not exist at all. This is what ignorance is doing. As I mentioned last week, it's not just a not knowing, it is a misknowing. It thinks the monster is real. It thinks that there is a level of reality that doesn't exist at all. So Geshe Sopa goes on to say, the basic object of this view, the conventional self, exists, meaning that we're not negating the self in its entirety. It's not quite like the same as the example I was using of the monster. We're not getting rid of, everything that and completely annihilating it. Rather, we're recognizing that there is a conventional self, but the idea of a real self that is imputed upon that by our ignorance, that does not exist. We're going to get into that a little bit later in this course when we talk about the two truths. But this is an important distinction to recognize that in this context, we're never negating the self in its entirety. And by self in this context, we mean the person, the I, in that very subtle way that it does exist, but it doesn't exist in this coarser way that ignorance is holding to. So then Geshe Sopa goes on to say the problem with that conventional self is that the innate egoistic mind holds the conventional self, that I that exists at a very subtle level, to exist inherently, and to have some quality that it does not possess at all. So the yogi sees that grasping the self in this way is the root of all suffering, because we reify that sense of an I and act from that basis of that reified self. So the yogi strives to negate that inherently existent self and free himself from the distorted mind that grasps it. So if we negate what is the object of that ignorance, again, the inherently existent I, then we become free of the distorted mind that is grasping at that misconceived I. continue on. I realize these start to sound kind of the same, but they're all just driving this point home, and then we'll get to what Geshe Sopa shares in terms of this analogy. He says, since an inherently existent self is naturally non-existent, meaning it has never existed at all. It has no existence. It's just a misconception. It is an idea, an erroneous idea that we've had since beginningless time, but has never had any truth to it whatsoever. It is naturally non-existent. Since that's the case, the object that's held by the egoistic mind can be negated by logical reasons. Just like, again, back to the monster, we shine the light in all the various corners and we show that it doesn't exist here, doesn't exist there. The logical reasons we're talking about here are like the light that we shine, that we bring that light of wisdom to our own reasoning, and we can negate the erroneous ways that we're holding ourselves and all phenomena to exist. In this section, Geshe Sopa is mostly holding to, the view of the I, me, as inherently existent, that is driving the whole show. But again, we're doing this with regard to all phenomena. So then he says, therefore, based on extensive study, logical analysis, and meditation, again, these are the three types of wisdom in essence: the study, hearing, listening that we need to do, the logical analysis, which is our thinking about, reflecting upon the teachings on emptiness, and then eventually our meditation. The yogi gradually develops the wisdom understanding that such an object, an inherently existent self, simply does not exist. So this is again reiterating that process we talked about last week. Here's the example that he uses again of the snake rope analogy. And so he says, this is kind of an interesting comment. He says, there is a sense in which we cannot negate an object that never existed in the first place. I mean, this is true with regard to the monster, right? When you're working with a young child that has a fear of a monster in the room, the monster doesn't exist, right? You're trying to negate something that already doesn't exist to somebody who believes that it exists. But this is the crux of it, is that until you can show the person who believes that it exists that it doesn't exist, that non-existence doesn't register for them. It's not something that has an impact on them. So even though this has never existed, the false belief in it is what has kept everything going, just like the false belief in the monster would keep the child in fear. And the young girl would have difficulty sleeping and maybe screaming at night because any little noise or sound she thinks is the monster or what have you. So it's very, it's again, an interesting observation. We're not negating something that did exist in the first place. This never existed in the first place. So he says here, consider the classic example of someone who thinks a piece of coiled rope, maybe it's even like a striped rope or something that has a little bit of markings like white with some red on it or something. And we see it just in a dark corner with very little light. And so we think this piece of coiled rope is a snake. A piece of coiled rope is never a snake. The snake does not exist. So there is no need to refute it. I mean, the coiled rope, there's no snakeness whatsoever on that coiled rope, right? So negating it as a snake doesn't seem to make sense because there's never been a snake there. It's only been a coiled rope. Then he goes on to say, however, the mind that mistakenly holds the coiled rope to be a snake does exist. Again, this is that object of negation that does exist that we have to negate through seeing that the object it is adhering to doesn't exist at all, never did exist. So as he says here, we negate the object of this distorted mind by investigating and coming to see that the thing in the corner is a rope and not a snake. So that initially you'd see it and you'd get this fear because you go, oh my gosh, there's a snake there in the corner. And then, you look a little bit further and maybe even get a flashlight and you go, oh, that's not really a snake at all. That's just a coiled rope. So similarly, we negate the object of the distorted mind that holds the self to be inherently existent by logically investigating and coming to see that there is no inherently existent self. And again, that's what this whole course is about. This first point is really an introduction to get us in the arena of, what we need to be doing, which is to negate this false sense of self that we have been clinging to that doesn't exist at all. I mean, they say that, of course, when we're going to get to this at the very tail end of this course, when you apply this understanding to others, it just breaks your heart. I mean, it should break our hearts for ourselves first. And that's what, of course, the path teaches us, is that we first have to become, very compassionate towards ourselves because we see that we've been suffering really needlessly. If we only knew the reality of things, if we only knew that what we've been clinging to doesn't exist at all, we wouldn't have to experience one iota of suffering. But it's true for others as well. And that's why, again, we're going to talk about that when we come around at the end of this course to talk about the effect that our understanding of emptiness has on our compassion. That we see that these two wings of the bird of wisdom and compassion actually complement each other very much in terms of helping us on our path. But this is the case for us. We've been clinging to something false. We're like that child, that young girl who's believing in the monster all the time and never having disproved it. But of course, most beings aren't even aware that they're doing this. Most beings aren't even aware of the extent to which they are suffering from that. And in this life, they might have things relatively good, but because they don't have the understanding of how things go from life to life and so on, and then they lack anything that would help them to address that. So this is the gist of this section, is to really get us to understand that this object has to be negated. And so we have to get very clear about what that is. Then we have another little quote that's at the very bottom of page 2 of the booklet. This is from the King of Meditative Stabilization Sutra, Samadhi Raja Sutra, quoted in Meditation on Emptiness, again by Jeffrey Hopkins. He says there, if the self, or in this verse it says, if the selflessness of phenomena is analyzed, and if this analysis is cultivated, it causes the effect of attaining nirvana. Through no other cause does one come to peace. So this is kind of taking off from what we just saw, that we need to do this analysis. We need to investigate, just like the person investigating the coiled rope to make sure it's not a snake, or to, get rid of the view of there being some monster in the room, whatever, analogy we use. We need to investigate. We need to have an analysis. If we cultivate that analysis, and that analysis hits home because we've done it correctly, we will eventually attain nirvana. And not just the nirvana that is our own liberation, but the nirvana that is non-abiding, that is the state of Buddhahood. And then this final quote from the Buddha, through no other cause does one come to peace. This is it, folks. This is the one pathway that will lead us to that. And so this is our crack at it this lifetime, when we've had all the conditions come together. So Jeffrey Hopkins, in commenting on that verse where it was presented in that around page 31, he says, one must analyze well whether the inherent existence of phenomena, and phenomena here in this context includes both the person, the self, the I, as well as all phenomena, as it is conceived by the innate non-analytical intellect, exists or not. So this is, again, something that the Buddha says is innate. We have it from life to life. It has carried forward from beginningless time. And it's not an analytical intellect. It's just a natural predisposition that we have to conceive of phenomena as inherently existent. So we have to see whether that inherent existence of phenomena, that object that we're clinging to, exists or not. Through reasoning and scriptural citation, like what we're doing in this course, one must ascertain that objects do not exist as conceived, and penetratingly understand the falseness of inherent existence. So this is how we go about achieving that, ascertaining that negation of the object that we are clinging to. This false sense of an inherently existent I, an inherently existent computer, an inherently existent everything. Whoops, I did up rather than down. Then he concludes this part saying, it is very important to analyze again and again with discriminating wisdom. I don't think we can do enough meditation on emptiness, but obviously we have to, temper this with other practices and so on. But it's a very important topic for us to meditate on and to analyze through the various reasonings that we'll be looking at. Then we have the last two verses of this section that come from Arya Deva's text, again, the 400 stanzas, which is a text I've never read from first to last page, but has lots of wonderful verses in it that are quoted frequently. And these two are really pretty well known as well, because the very first verse, 190, says the order in which we have to kind of go about achieving this realization. He says, first, prevent the demeritorious. In other words, stop sentient beings from engaging in unskillful actions. This is where we start in our Lam Rim studies as well. Why? Because cause and effect are held up with entirely within the sphere of the understanding of emptiness. And if we ever want to have an opportunity to continue to develop our wisdom, we need to have good rebirths. We need to have good conditions in those rebirths. So we have to first have a prevention of what is demeritorious, what is non-virtuous, that will lead us into unfavorable states and in conditions that are poor, even when we do have favorable states. Next, prevent ideas of a coarse self. And again, we know some of you have studied emptiness before, and the tenets, presentation of tenets, know that there are different views of self that are set out that the Buddha refuted, and some of them are much coarser than what we're talking about in this course, in this series of teachings. But again, we'll go into that a little bit later. Then later, prevent views of all kinds. Do everything that we can to refute, especially the view of inherent existence, the selfless, to establish selflessness in our own minds. So whoever knows of this path, this sort of approach of starting where sentient beings are at, helping them to engage in virtue, avoid non-virtue, helping them to develop a view that refutes coarser views of the self, and then eventually refutes the subtlest views of the self. Whoever knows of this is wise. So I'm going to read the commentary here that Gyaltsab Je that's what's in that book, the Yogic Deeds of Bodhisattvas, that Geshe Sonam Rinchen and Ruth Sonam did. And so again, it's their translation that I'm reading here. It says, initially, therefore, they should be taught about virtuous and non-virtuous actions and about cause and effect, since that is easy to understand. Easy to understand, but I think hard for a lot of people to accept. Karma is a very difficult subject for many beings to accept, but as it is the proper time, Gyaltsab Je says, they should thus be prevented from engaging in demeritorious deeds. Misdeeds. So the idea here again is that this is what we learn in our very beginning level of the Lam Rim. Karma is the main topic of what we often call the small scope, or what Lama Zopa prefers to call the scope for the small capable being. The least capacity in terms of our spiritual practice is to turn away from our attachment to this life and at least become focused on our next rebirth. That means we have to engage in positive actions. We have to abandon negative actions so that at the end of this life, we will have planted enough seeds of virtue that will ripen based on our, having developed the strength of that into a good rebirth, into an opportunity to continue our spiritual path. Now, sure, it'd be wonderful if we could become liberated or enlightened in this single lifetime, and the tantric teachings to say that we can become a Buddha in this lifetime. But as I hear from almost all my teachers, for most of us, we're going to need a continuity of good rebirths. So how do we begin leading being skillfully, or begin our own spiritual path of moving towards this wisdom realizing emptiness? We first start with the conventional reality of needing to pay attention to karma. Pay heed to the law of cause and effect so that we have a good number of rebirths that will allow us to continue our spiritual development. Then we again looked at the idea of these coarse views that need to be refuted. So let's look at what Gyaltsab Je says on that. And here, I'm not going to explain all of this because it gets a little complicated. He says, next, the coarse self should be repudiated by refuting the referent object of 20 views of the transitory collection by means of a fivefold analysis of the aggregates. This is set out in many of the texts, but it gets at some of these more acquired views of the self that can be there. I'm not going to go into all of that as part of this course, but know that, as I mentioned earlier, we will talk about these when we get to refuting the self of persons, this I, because this is where we have most of these misconceptions. And I'll introduce them very briefly. The coarsest conception that we can have about the I is what's taught in the Vedic traditions in terms of there being an Atman. Atman is usually translated as a soul. It's probably equivalent to some degree to what I was raised Catholic. I was taught I had a soul, an immortal soul that was sort of some essence of me that would go on to heaven or hell or purgatory or wherever, I don't know. But this idea in the Vedic traditions is that there is something called the Atman that is a sort of permanent, unchanging, unitary phenomenon that has an independent quality to it. It's independent of the mind and body. It's, something that they hold to existing, but the Buddha says doesn't exist at all. The Buddha teaches anatman, the refutation of this. This is actually an acquired view. I mean, no, people aren't born into their lives thinking that this exists, that they have a soul. I mean, think about it. If you were brought up in a tradition where you were told you had a soul, until you had that teaching, you didn't know that. You think about that. You didn't, because where is the referent of that soul? Where's the object that is that soul? And this is how the Buddha essentially refutes it. He says, if you take the mind and body, which are the basis for being, and set them aside, is there a soul or an Atman left there on the cushion? Where is that thing? It doesn't have any existence in conventional reality, much less in a more ultimate way. The second type of I that is refuted is often called a self-sufficient, substantially existent self. And again, I might go into that again when we get to the refutation of the I. Those are coarser views. Again, this one's a little subtler, though, than that first one. And this one, the Buddha actually says, is innate within us. We do have this sense of an I. It's just not the subtlest version of an I that we're clinging to. And it's the idea of an I that is kind of the boss, the manager, the master. And we often have this thought, right, with regard to our body and mind. We may wake up in the morning and we go, oh, my mind's a mess today. Well, who's the me that owns that mind? Who's the me that's in charge of that mind? And we might think the same thing about our body. My body is really just, totally, a wreck today. Well, again, who's the possessor of that? Even His Holiness the Dalai Lama points out the fact that if you were given the option to exchange your mind for a clearer, more vibrant, investigative mind, something that would be really like His Holiness's mind or something like that, that you would gladly do that, right? You would think, I'm going to take their mind and put it in my head and my body and whatever, wherever it would be located, and I'm going to get rid of this old mind that I have. Like there's some sort of person here that would be able to still experience all of that, independent of that mind. And you could do the same with the body. I mean, as many of us are aging, we would love to have a youthful body again, right? Give me a teenage body or something so that I can do all the things that I'd like to do with more energy and what have you. And so we would think, yes, I'd gladly take that more youthful, energetic body and replace my body with that. Well, again, who's that I that would do that? Jeffrey Hopkins says the analogy that he likes to use is where you have like a head salesperson in charge of a sales department. So all of the sales department are all the parts of the mind and the body and so on that we manage, that we take care of. And we think there's like a head person there who's kind of among all of that, but is still having some distinctive role to play. Well, this too, we do have an innate sense of that there's someone in charge here. Who's in charge? This being doesn't exist. This can also be refuted, and we'll look at that when we get to looking at this sense of an I. But again, the subtlest view of a self that this orientation that we're using throughout this course, which is called the Prasangika Madhyamika, the consequence middle way school, what we are getting at negating is this sense that there is a real I, that there is some level of intrinsic existence to that I, an ability for that I to be established on its own. And we come to the conclusion that that can't exist either, because it can't exist as being one with the body or with the mind or even with the combination of those. It can't exist independent of that. And so this is the subtlest way that the I is misconceived to exist. So again, there are coarser views that ideally we should be led to before being introduced to this Prasangika Madhyamika point of view. But most of us, we come into Tibetan Buddhism in particular, and right off the get-go, we get that most profound, subtlest view of emptiness, and we never really investigate these other ones. Again, the first one might be acquired, or certainly acquired, and we might have acquired that ourselves. The second one is innate and is also to be refuted because it doesn't exist at all, but it's not the root problem. The root problem is thinking that the I is here in this real way, and we're going to get into that in the very next section in terms of describing that a little bit better so that we have a more complete understanding of that. So that was the second step. First step, get beings and ourselves to really subscribe to the concept of karma and abandon our non-virtue and move towards virtue. Then refute the coarse views. Then, Later, when the mind has become receptive, selflessness of persons is taught in the way that I was just talking about, this view of refuting this real I, this intrinsically existent I, substantially existent I, and so on, different ways it's described. And by showing that even selflessness does not exist truly, which of course is the real test whether one is still adhering to some level of inherent existence, is do we think that that selflessness is existing inherently? We have to refute anything as existing inherently. Even emptiness or selflessness itself does not exist from its own side. And we'll get into this again in the next section, where we understand how phenomena actually do exist and how they don't exist. So by finally getting to that place where we understand that all phenomena are selfless or empty, all views conceiving extremes are prevented. So this is the idea behind that verse number 190. Um, Gyaltsep Je says a few more things. He says, whoever knows these stages of teaching is wise regarding the sequence in which trainees are led. It is like a skilled physician who prescribes a bland or oily diet to specific patients. Depending upon where you're at in your own development, the Buddha has teachings that pertain to you. That's why we look at the 3 levels of the stages of the path, the small scope, middle scope, great scope, and so on. Even the tantric teachings are not appropriate for everybody. You have to be like a skillful doctor who prescribes exactly what's needed for that patient. Then this is the questions that lead us into the next verse. In Gyaltsep Je's commentary, a question comes forward saying, by what path is liberation attained then? And the answer is by understanding that all phenomena are empty of inherent existence. And this is the view of Prasangika Madhyamika, the consequence middle way school, is that this is the only way to attain liberation or enlightenment, is by having this realization. The other realizations, the coarser views of self that are refuted, those are a part of our process, but they don't get you to liberation in and of themselves. They are stepping stones to get you to this final view of selflessness. Then a qualm is raised, and it says, since there are limitless things, their realities are also limitless. Who could know them all? So if you think that, okay, I have to realize the selflessness of all phenomena, that means I have to realize the selflessness of these headphones, and the selflessness of my glasses, and the selflessness of this bowl, and the selflessness of my phone, and everything around me. Well, that means I have a lot of work to do, because phenomena are infinite, and I have to refute the sense of self that I have with regard to everything that exists. It's kind of a crazy qualm, but nonetheless, one that does need to be addressed if we're ever to really understand what is happening in this process, because the answer reveals what actually occurs. Here, Gyaltsep Je says, and this is a continuation, I'm sorry, of the qualm. Moreover, it is said that one cannot attain liberation while there is a single phenomenon one does not know and has not abandoned. So if we are clinging to any phenomenon as inherently existent, we can't attain liberation. You have to remove the ignorance with regard to every single phenomenon. Okay, so that leads us to verse 191 that is also in your little collection of verses. Here Aryadeva says, whoever sees one thing is said to see all. That which is the emptiness of one is the emptiness of all. So it is important that we take a look at what this means, because it could be misunderstood even. But the concept is that when we have realized the emptiness of one thing, we then have understood its lack of inherent existence. So say we do start with the I, which is where we're going to start when we get to the more deeper investigations using the reasonings. And that is the great advice that has been given through time, is to start with the person first and then negate with regard to other phenomena, phenomena other than the person. If we do negate it with regard to the I that we are clinging to so tightly, we should be able to turn our understanding to any other phenomenon and analyze it very quickly in the same way and come to the same conclusion. We are not actually knowing the emptiness of every phenomenon by knowing the emptiness of I, but we are understanding the logic and the reasoning that lead us to that conclusion. And we are therefore able to arrive at the same understanding, that the phone is empty of inherent existence, and the computer is empty of inherent existence, and these headphones are empty of inherent existence, and everything that exists is empty of inherent existence. In that way, we are knowing the emptiness of all, because when we have truly understood the emptiness of one thing, it's exactly the same with regard to any other phenomenon. This is why we can talk about everything being of one taste. It doesn't mean that there is some huge vat of emptiness that everything is, coming from. It means that everything has this quality. If it is an existent object, it has that quality of being empty and of inherent existence. And that emptiness has the same taste in terms of it being a refutation, a negation of inherent existence with respect to whatever phenomenon is the basis of that understanding. So let's look at what the commentary says on this. That will elucidate those words I shared with you, hopefully. So here, Gyaltsab says, whoever sees one thing's fundamental mode of existence, which is its emptiness of inherent existence, is said to see the reality of all things, because the emptiness is the same with regard to all things. It's that way that they are of one taste, though they are still a unique phenomenon. The emptiness of me is not the same as the emptiness of you in terms of those are two different bases. But nonetheless, that emptiness is, no different in terms of it being, once more, a refutation of inherent existence. So once more, from this Samadhi Raja Sutra, the King of Meditative Stabilizations, it says, through one, all are known, and through one, all are seen. And then another quote that's given in this section by Gyaltsab is Meditative Stabilization of Gagana Ganja, which says, whoever through one phenomenon knows all phenomena are like illusions, mirages, and are incomprehensible, hollow, deceptive, and ephemeral, will before long reach the essence of enlightenment. So when we, again, know one phenomenon as being illusory, having that quality of appearing in a way that is contrary to how it actually exists, and we refute that concept of inherent existence with regard to it, that is what will get us to enlightenment, because it's the same thing with regard to all phenomena. So once we know that one phenomenon has that quality, we know that all phenomena are illusory, that they're like mirages appearing to be water when they're not, or like an echo that appears to be a real voice when it is not, and so on, various illusions, analogies that were used. So then he says it's like the following analogy with regard to our knowing emptiness. By drinking one drop of seawater, you know the rest of the drops in the ocean are salty, right? You just need to taste one drop and then you get, oh, this is what the whole ocean tastes like. That which is the emptiness of one thing is the emptiness of all, means the very emptiness of true existence is the fundamental mode of existence of all phenomena at that ultimate level. Again, everything conventionally appears very different. I am different than you. I'm different from a computer. I'm different from, all the other phenomena. But that doesn't mean that my final mode of existing is different. The final mode of existing of me, of you, of every phenomenon is the emptiness of true existence. So that emptiness does not appear in different ways, as do blue and yellow, Gyaltsab says, right? Blue and yellow appear very different to our eye consciousness. But that emptiness doesn't appear different in different ways. The emptiness of the computer and the emptiness of me both appear in the same way, as a lack of inherent existence with respect to, again, a different basis, but it's the lack of inherent existence. That negation is what is known as emptiness. However, one should not assert, and this is the point I was making earlier, however, one should not assert in relation to an inferential cognition that the awareness cognizing the pot's emptiness of true existence cognizes the woolen cloth's emptiness of true existence. It is like the space in different receptacles. So if I had 10 different cups, we could say that there's a different space in each of those cups, right? Because the cup composes a certain amount of space and it's different. It's not the same space that each of those cups is composing. In the same way, a pot and a woolen cloth both have their own respective emptiness that is posited with relation to that basis. So when I'm cognizing the pot's emptiness of true existence, I'm not cognizing the woolen cloth's emptiness of true existence. Although, as was said in the previous slide, the fundamental mode of existence of all phenomena is the same. When we get to that level of understanding its emptiness, it is refuting the same thing, which is inherent existence. But in terms of it being a unique phenomenon, the emptiness of a pot is different than the emptiness of woolen cloth. So there is a footnote on this that I thought was worth sharing in the text, that book. And this is from Jitsumpa. Jitsumpa is Jitsun Choki Gyaltsen, who wrote the textbooks for Serije Monastery. He's commenting on the citation from the King of Meditative Stabilizations that we looked at in his general meaning of the middle way, says, it does not follow that when one cognizes the emptiness of one phenomenon, one cognizes the emptiness of other phenomena, right? Because that is the emptiness of the phenomenon that we are working with as the basis of understanding that emptiness. We can't say we're cognizing the emptiness of something else because that's what we were analyzing. These citations mean that when a valid cognition ascertains emptiness or lack of true existence with respect to one established base, such as me, the lack of true existence of another base can be cognized merely by directing the mind to it, with the question whether or not it is truly existent. So this is the effectiveness of our analysis. If we've done it correctly with regard to one object, all we need to do is turn to another object. And the reasoning should flow right immediately. We'll get that that also is lacking in inherent existence. It is empty of that. The emptiness of things can be established very easily if we've done the correct analysis with regard to one phenomenon. So the final part of that footnote says, this implies that the whole process of reasoning, which induced the initial cognition, does not need to be repeated. Meaning, again, the whole process, we still would have to do some investigation into another object. So say after we've done it with regard to the eye, we then do it with regard to the body, which is not the eye. That's the whole point of the eye not inherently existent, is that the eye is not equivalent to the body. The body is its own phenomenon. But we think the body is inherently existent too. So then we would analyze the body. But we don't have to go through the entire process because we've already come to the end. We've already read the last page of the novel. We've already gotten to the conclusion because we've analyzed the I, the self, with regard to the steps of analysis. And we've come to that conclusion through our inferential awareness that the I doesn't inherently exist. So then all we need to do is turn our mind towards the body or the computer or whatever it is we're analyzing, and it will naturally flow. That too will come to the same conclusion. This is actually, they say, is the way that we can test our understanding of emptiness and make sure that we haven't acquired one of the coarser views in refuting something that is coarser, is that if we actually can take that understanding and apply it to any other phenomenon, and it gets you there, you're able to go, oh yeah, that too is empty of inherent existence. I understand completely with regard to that. Well, then that's the measure of the effectiveness of our initial investigation into inherent existence. So let me see if I had anything else to do on this. No, going on to the next one. What time is it? Maybe let's go and at least do the first part of this, and then we'll see if there are any questions. Again, write any questions in the chat box if you do have them on what we've just gone through. That concludes the first section, why we need to realize emptiness. And it was already pointing us in the direction of kind of an understanding of emptiness to some degree. But the second topic is to look at what exists, which is to be able to still hold that things have some existence in the space of emptiness, and what doesn't exist, which of course is what emptiness is refuting. I guess isn't, the whole, by this title, I'm not meaning everything that we have to look at everything that exists and everything that doesn't exist. In fact, everything that doesn't exist and everything that exists, these are infinite categories. But the idea here is that we have to establish what does exist and how does it exist, and then what doesn't exist and why doesn't it exist in terms of, again, inherent existence. So the very first verse is what I'm going to spend probably the rest of tonight on. I don't know that I'll get beyond this. This comes from once more the 9th chapter of Shantideva's text, Perfection of Wisdom chapter, a bit further into that chapter, where he says, without contacting the entity that is imputed, the inherently existent I that is imputed on the basis of this, sense of an I that we have with regard to the mind and body, the absence with respect to the entity, the emptiness of that, in other words, which is that, would not be apprehended. We couldn't get at the actual apprehension of emptiness of inherently existent I without really understanding and contacting the inherently existent I that we're trying to get at. In other words, we have to be very clear about what we call the object of negation. And again, recall that earlier I said there were two objects of negation in a sense. One is the ignorance that we have to negate through a process of reasoning that was spelled out earlier, that again can be refuted by refuting its object. The object of our ignorance, it doesn't exist at all. Again, recall the analogy of the rope snake or the monster in the room or whatever. There is a object that is believed in that doesn't exist at all, and there is the false belief in that. The false belief is negated, is gotten rid of, is dissolved, as was used in the one earlier translation, by understanding that its object doesn't exist. Well, we have to get really clear about what that object is that we're refuting. That's why, again, even some of those coarser views, you can refute those too, but they're not going to get you to that final refutation of inherent existence unless you really understand what is meant by inherent existence. If something were to inherently exist, what would it be like? You know, what's interesting is we are swimming in this misconception of inherent existence all the time. So some teacher or some text, I can't remember where I saw it, said it's kind of like trying to get a fish to understand what water is when that's what it's living in all the time. You know, it doesn't really have any other conception, maybe other than that's its abode. That's where it actually is. Well, we are believing in everything to inherently exist. It surrounds us. It pervades us. I wouldn't say that every single moment of our mind is infused with that ignorance, but that ignorance is ready to arise. And if we have any delusion present, it is most definitely there. So we have to get clear. Master Shantideva, one interpretation of this, there are other interpretations of these two lines because they're fitting into a section where they're talking about the emptiness of emptiness, which I won't go into in too much detail, but emptiness being a phenomenon also is empty of inherent existence because nothing exists inherently. But nonetheless, in this context, we're really looking at this idea that we have to get clear, we have to touch on, make contact with that false sense of an I or whatever phenomenon we're analyzing. We have to get that coming into our awareness in order for us to refute it. We have to see what it is that we are actually trying to negate. Again, it sounds strange, as Geshe Sopa was saying, that we have to negate something that never existed in the first place. But we believe in that. You know, we have this innate belief in it. So this is from an interesting little commentary on the 9th chapter that was published by Padmakara group. And it is a commentary, two different commentaries on the 9th chapter of Shantideva, both by Nyingma masters. This one, Minyak Kunzang Sonam, was a student of Patro Rinpoche, who was a great Nyingma master. Nyingma, again, being the first school of Tibetan Buddhism. We are studying here in Gelugpa, which is actually the last of the four schools that developed. Anyway, he says, again, these two lines can also be explained thus. As I mentioned, there's a different interpretation, but this is the interpretation that I'm presenting this verse with. If the thought does not apprehend or observe the object of investigation, or what we call again the object of negation, it cannot apprehend its nature, that is, its absence of true existence. This shows that if the thought of true existence, the object of negation, does not manifest, the certainty about emptiness, that is, the absence of true existence, cannot manifest either. In other words, we have to be clear about what it is that this ignorance, this mistaken conception is grasping at. What is its mode of apprehending the object, getting at that object to inherently exist in order to refute it? Otherwise, the absence of true existence, its emptiness, can't manifest. We can't actually get to that understanding of that. And he says that since to obtain certainty regarding emptiness, it is important. Oops, I put it is in there twice. Since regarding emptiness, it is important to have certainty regarding the appearing mode of the object of negation. So again, we have to have an appearing mode of the object of negation. We need to see how things look when they appear to be inherently existent. Now, here I might have to put in my own little footnote, which is those of you who might be new to this topic, know that there is a false appearance of things inherently existent that is playing into this. So I've been mostly talking about the false conception of inherent existence, that we think that there's something that doesn't exist. You know, the other part of this that needs to be accentuated, and that Lama Zopa always is emphasizing, is that there's a false appearance from the side of everything that exists. This is caused by a very subtle imprint in our minds that has taken root because of our misconception of this inherent existence throughout time. This very subtle latencies that cause everything to have this false appearance. So everything that appears to you appears to have its own mode of subsistence. It appears to be existing from its own side. It appears to be self-established, to be inherently existent. That's a false appearance that is within our own minds. It is created through the force of us having had this ignorance since beginningless time. In fact, this is what they say are the subtlest obscurations that need to be removed from the mind. The first that we need to remove is our ignorance, which is what we're focusing, initially on in this whole reasoning. And that is an important part of the process, right? Because we have to stop believing in that false appearance. We have to stop thinking that things exist in the way that they appear to this mind. And this is within our sense consciousnesses. This is within our conceptual mind, our mental consciousness. Everything that appears to us seems to have its own mode of subsistence. It appears to exist on its own, independent. And we'll look more about what that means to say independent shortly. But this false appearance, we then adhere to that false appearance. We think that that's real. Now, the analogy that I often use, that the Buddha used frequently to talk about the misconception of inherent existence and that false appearance, is the idea of a dream. And again, I don't know everyone else's dreams. I can infer based on my own experience with my dreams what your dreams are like. But I know when I'm dreaming, like I was even dreaming the other night that I was in a store without my mask on, and it was terrifying. People were coming up to me and they were giving me all these weird looks, and it's strange when you start bringing your daily life into your dreams. But in that dream, I was having the real experience, right? It felt really real. Like I was there. I didn't have my mask. I was, oh my God, where's my mask? And so I was believing in the reality of that dream, and that dream was appearing to be real to me. Now, of course, when I woke up, I realized, oh, I didn't go into the store with my mask, missing my mask and all of this. So I could know from the awakened state that what I was believing in, which is this false conception that there's a real me going through these experiences in the dream, and also what was appearing to me, that they both lack reality. They're not in accord with reality. And if I learn how to lucidly dream, I could go into my dream state. And even though in my dream, I'd still not be wearing a mask and everyone would be coming up to me and giving me weird looks and telling me, oh, you're not wearing a mask, get out of here, or whatever. I would know that that's not real. If I was lucidly dreaming, I would go, oh, I'm in a dream state. This is just a false appearance. This is an appearance of these people and everything happening, but it's not real. So there's a similar thing going on in our every moment of our lives, whether we're dreaming or whether we're out of our dreams, and that we are believing in this false appearance, and things are appearing from their side to be real. They're appearing to be as real as the things in our dream state appear to be real, but can be refuted when we wake up. Those too can eventually be refuted when we wake up to the reality of emptiness, that things don't have any inherent existence. So I don't know if that helps or not, but the idea is that this is also why it's very difficult to realize emptiness, is because we are not just like involved in this from our side, believing in all of this, but we have these subtle imprints that cause everything to seem so real, to appear to be so real, that we have to refute not just the misunderstanding or misbelief in that, but we have to refute even what is appearing to us, because it's not appearing to us correctly. It's like the dream objects that are appearing to be real, but are not really real. We first have to stop our believing in them, and then eventually we can be free of those entirely. Maybe that's where the dream analogy doesn't completely work, but this is what we are trying to do. And this is, of course, how the bodhisattva develops their mind, is they first get rid of that misconception, and then they get rid of the subtle imprints. Those are what are called the knowledge obscurations, the obscurations to omniscience. Those are removed at the very tail end of the bodhisattva path, just before attaining Buddhahood. But they are what keep you from having the full awareness of all things, because they are blocking it with some level of duality, of there being an object out there that is appearing real, and the inability for the subjective awareness to get past that. So it's like the last block to knowing all phenomena in the mind of a Buddha, the omniscience of a Buddha. So again, this is just a little footnote about what else is going on here. So it's not just that we're trying to get rid of our misconception, like the whole idea of the young girl in the room. That's just a misconception based on nothing really appearing, right? It's just her imagination. She thinks there's a monster because she saw something in a movie or TV, and then she's imagining all of this. Well, we're imagining to some degree, but there's an imaginary thing appearing to us. It's giving us that feedback that it's real out there, but it's not real out there. We have to first stop believing in that it's real, and then eventually, when we've realized that, we can undermine that false appearance. And as I said, that's the last block to becoming a Buddha. So let's go back and just look at one or two slides, and then we'll stop for tonight. So this is from Geshe Yeshe Topten. It's his commentary in a book that was originally published as The Way of Awakening. I can't remember what it's called now. It's been republished. It really bothers me when these Dharma companies, publishing companies, republish books that were originally published under one title as a new title, and then you don't know, oh, is this really a book that I have or don't have, or anyway, but it's under a new title now. But he says here, the Madhyamika's reply, because the previous verse was a question, saying, even though the valid mind that realizes emptiness and emptiness itself are both non-truly existent, remember I mentioned how that's one way of reading into Shantideva's verse, and therefore illusory or false, in order to understand the meaning of the non-true existence of an object or phenomenon, one should first correctly identify true existence, which is the object to be negated. This is where it starts. We have to know what we're negating. Without identifying the object to be negated, true existence, there cannot be perception of its non-existence by a valid mind. We can't come to know the non-existence of that unless we've kind of seen what it is that we're refuting, what it is that we're trying to deny through this reasoning and analysis. In order to realize emptiness, we should first have a clear idea of what true or intrinsic existence means, or inherent existence. Again, many synonyms for this, and how true existence would be if it existed. Make that, it's all hypothetical because it doesn't exist, but what would it be if it existed? Well, we're surrounded by it all the time, and it's appearing to us all the time. It should be pretty clear, but nonetheless, because of that, because we're like that fish in water, it's very hard to actually get an exact view of what it is that we're negating. That's why Tsongkhapa spends so much time in his great treatise, the Lamrim Chenmo, getting at identifying the object of negation, how we might go too far and negate too much, how we might go too little and not negate enough. So he says we have to, see how it would be if it existed, because only after having established its characteristics can we understand that it does not exist. If we suppose that there is a thief in the crowd, for example, we must first identify him if we want to arrest him. If you can't give any, clue as to what the thief looks like, the police show up and you're like, well, I don't know, it was somebody, they took my wallet, I have no idea who it is. Well, they're like, well, I can't find that person in the crowd. If you're at like a huge crowd back in the pre-COVID days where everybody was, not socially distancing, and you had somebody take your wallet or purse or what have you, you'd be like, well, I have to have some inkling of what I'm looking for. If you don't have any idea what you're looking for, you're never going to find the thief. That's the analogy they use for this. You have to have some idea of what it is that you're trying to negate. What is this sense of a truly existent I, an inherently existent I, or whatever phenomenon, again, that we're working with? So then I wanted to share a little bit from the book that I did send out a book list, had that, Mary posted that out on the materials thing at the Dropbox. This is the book that was at the top of the list because this is the one I mentioned last week as well, Insight into Emptiness, which I think is really excellent for those who are, again, wanting to approach it. It's a little scholarly, but it's really, I think, much more approachable than like Meditation on Emptiness by Jeffrey Hopkins. But there are a couple of other books again on the list, but this is the one I would encourage you to use in your own investigation into this topic. He says, our understanding of the object of negation must not be just on the level of words, like what we're doing here tonight, lots of words. It is not so useful in itself to say a truly existent I doesn't exist. We may even be able to recite all the reasons why something cannot inherently exist. I mean, all the things we're going to go through in this course, the reasoning of dependent arising, the reasoning of the four-point analysis, and so on, all these various things that we can, say We can talk about them till the cows come home, but saying those isn't enough. But if we haven't analyzed the meaning ourselves, he says, there's not much effect on our minds. So, we can talk to all of this, but we really have to meditate on this. We really have to reflect on these teachings. So then he says, to derive the greatest possible benefit from meditation on emptiness, we need to have a clear image of what a thing would be like if it were truly existent. Although inherent existence doesn't exist, it appears to us. Normally, we do not question how objects appear to us and how we grasp or apprehend them to exist. And certainly this is true of all beings who've never encountered these teachings. They never question reality. They assume it's real because that's how it appears and that's what they believe in. But, we have to begin to question that. Even though it doesn't exist, we have to do that because we're never going to refute it otherwise. So then he gives us the advice, now, though, we must begin to observe and recognize the way in which things appear to the true grasping mind and the way that mind apprehends or grasps them. Then, through various lines of reasoning, we explore if inherent existence could possibly exist. So again, this is what we're doing in this section, is getting really clear about what the object of negation is, in other words, what doesn't exist, so we can refute it, so we can come to understand its non-existence and thereby understand emptiness. So let me just introduce this real quickly, and then we'll take a break for questions before we conclude. So what is meant by inherent existence? Know that Jeffrey Hopkins, in his meditation on emptiness, he says that which is negated in the Prasangikas, again, Prasangika is the consequence school of the middle way, the Madhyamika school, then their subtle theory of selflessness is self. In this case, self doesn't mean the I that exists as um, a conventional phenomenon. It means the sense of self that we are negating, this fictitious self. That's why we use the word selflessness. It lacks that form of self, which we often define as inherent existence. But nonetheless, there are 17 hypothetical synonyms of self in the Prasangika system. And these are hypothetical because it doesn't exist. So a synonym technically would be referring to something that does exist. And so it's two ways of referring to something that does exist, at least, to have synonyms. But these 17 synonyms are not really synonyms because what we're referring to as this self that we're negating doesn't exist, as I've been pointing out earlier tonight. So I'll just run through this list and then we'll stop and I'll talk about them more in the next class. We'll reintroduce these. But this is an interesting little exercise because we see the different ways that this can be set out. Inherent existence can also be called true establishment, true existence, ultimate existence, existence as its own suchness, existence as its own reality, natural existence or existence by way of its own character, substantial existence, existence able to establish itself, existence from the object side rather than being imputed from the subject side, objective existence, existence through its own power, existence in the object that receives designation, existence right in the basis of designation, inherent existence, existence through its own entityness, existence in the manner of covering its basis of designation, existence from the side of the basis of designation. And what we'll be going into in the next class, I didn't get to dependent arising, is, as it says here, the subtle self that is negated in the Prasangika view of selflessness, all 17 of those terms, implies an independent entity. Notice we didn't use independent existence, but we could easily have said that. But it implies that the entity of it is independent, standing on its own. Thus, all of these terms are opposites of dependent arising, which is how things actually do exist. Each illuminates a little more the meaning of non-dependence. What it means for things to be not depending upon anything else, to have their own entity, to stand on their own, to be established from their own side. It gives a different flavor for what that means and what it is that we're trying to negate. And one of the analyses that we're going to see when eventually, probably in a couple of classes, is the 4-point analysis. And they say that this is the most crucial step. We have to really understand what it is we're negating, what it is that we're trying to get at and destroy, annihilate through this reasoning. They say if you have that correct, the rest of the steps are a breeze. Just like if you know what the thief looked like, if the thief was dressed like Waldo, those Where's Waldo cartoons, where you have to find Waldo. He's got the little stocking cap and the red and white striped shirt, and if you know all those details, then it's easy to find Waldo. You're looking for the exact Waldo. But if you don't know what Waldo looks like, good luck. It could be any of the people on the so so this is the whole gist of what we're talking about tonight. I apologize that we didn't get into dependent arising, but we definitely will get there next week. And that is a reasoning that you can begin to work with, if you haven't already, to help to undermine that sense of self. But I would encourage you to review these verses that we did look at, and you can certainly meditate on them. Again, understanding once more that, we do have to get some clarity about this conception of a self, that we need to eliminate it in order to attain liberation and so on. But any questions about all of what I've said tonight? God, I feel like I've been talking for 2 hours, but okay, we have one from Alejandra. I once heard a meditation recording recommending that to further understand emptiness, one can practice stopping several times a day and saying to oneself, everything I see is an illusion. Is this based on an actual Buddhist practice? What are your thoughts on practicing this? I think that the tricky thing is in the words that this person was advising. Everything I see is an illusion. It's not that it is an illusion; it's illusory. I mean, it's a fine distinction, because if we say it's an illusion, that means that it really um, doesn't have any existence at all in my mind. I mean, that's what just like if I said, if this life is a dream, when we sang that song, row, row, row your boat, life is but a dream. Well, if life was just a dream, there would be no consequences of it, right? Because I wouldn't have to experience any suffering, because the suffering's a dream. I wouldn't have any other emotions or anything, because it's just a dream. Because when I wake up from my dream, there's no real reality. Again, I wasn't in the store not wearing my mask. I was in my bed, so I think it's tricky to say that it is an illusion. The way that I always hear it framed, and Rinpoche does give this advice, is that we could see it as illusory, or like a hallucination, or again, different phrases that give us this idea that our strong clinging to it as real as it appears is not correct. And so it has an illusory quality in that it appears to be real, but it isn't real in that way at all. So we still don't negate the phenomenon itself, because the phenomenon is still there. It is illusory. When we equate it to an illusion, it just sounds a little different to me. And I hope you can appreciate that, Alejandra, as well as anyone else, that, when the Buddha is never saying that this whole life is a dream. It's like a dream, because there is a false appearance to reality that we can negate. There still is some very subtle level of reality. And that's where, if we said it's simply an illusion or a dream, we might be negating that in the process of negating the fictitious way that things are illusory or like a dream. So absolutely, Lama Zopa often suggests that we meditate he usually says like 3 different ways. One is to think that things are empty of inherent existence, if that works for you. If you've done enough analysis to where you can look at various things throughout your day and say, oh, my car is empty of inherent existence. My books are empty of inherent existence. I am empty of inherent existence. The second way is to do those with those same objects, but to think that it's like a hallucination, or illusory, or dreamlike, or whatever, something that gets you to that understanding that how it is appearing is not in accord with how it exists. It's like a mirage, any of these things that give that flavor. I think he usually uses like a hallucination. But the third level gets at the subtle mode of dependent arising that we're going to talk about next week, which is that things are merely imputed, merely designated, which helps us to embrace their way of existing in conventional reality at the deepest level, which then refutes that they have any substantial existence, any real existence. So we'll talk about that more next week. But absolutely, that would be a wonderful way to work with this in your day, is to just have that thought occasionally of, this is like an illusion. Something is appearing to me, but it doesn't exist in the way that it appears. But holding on to that idea that it still does exist, and we'll get into that next week in terms of that subtle way that things do have some existence, but not allowing us to believe in that illusion, to believe in that, dream, all of these things, to see that there is some fictitious appearance to that. I hope that helps. Then is this close from Cynthia? Although this appears, it does not exist, or although this does not exist, it appears. Oh, yeah, I mean, you'd have to qualify those words somewhat, I think, Cynthia. Although this appears, meaning although phenomena appear, it does not exist inherently. I mean, this is the tricky things a lot of times, and this may even be from like a sutra or something, where when the Buddha spoke, he often did it in shorthand. He would just say, it doesn't exist, but he doesn't mean it doesn't exist utterly, that there is no existence to things at all. Otherwise, I don't know, the path doesn't make a lot of sense if we say, I don't exist, you don't exist, Buddhahood doesn't exist, nirvana doesn't exist, samsara doesn't exist. It doesn't really do much. What we have to have some mode of existence. So again, we have to negate the false mode of existence, which is inherent existence. So I would interpret this saying, although things appear, my body appears, this lamp appears, the computer appears, all these various things, although they appear, they don't exist inherently in the way that they do appear. But that appearance of phenomena simply arising, that's how things do exist. They appear on the basis of causes and conditions, parts, imputation in the end. We'll talk about that next week. And then the other part, although this does not exist inherently, nonetheless it appears. And this is the whole thing of appearance and reality, is that there are appearance of things, and at the subtlest level, things do appear, but then there's also the fictitious appearance that does need to be negated because they don't have any of that level of reality that is falsely appearing to us. So appearance can be upheld within the understanding of reality when we understand it as simply the appearance of things that arise on the basis of various factors that are dependent arisings. So the Buddha never said there's no appearance at all of anything, there's only emptiness. The Buddha says there is emptiness on the basis of everything that appears, everything that is conventionally existing, dependent upon various factors. So if we understand that subtle mode of appearance, then we can posit again that things appear, but they don't have that inherent existence. And although they don't inherently exist, nonetheless, they appear. In fact, that's the way everything has always appeared, is out of the space of lacking inherent existence, out of emptiness. So I don't know if that made sense. But thank you for bringing that up, Cynthia. So again, any of these ideas, we'd have to again qualify. Now, if you were to say, I'm just thinking, after the fact, if you were to say, although this inherent existence appears, or inherently existent computer or whatever appears, it does not exist, then that would also be correct. And although this inherently existent computer doesn't exist, nonetheless computer appears. Well, then that would also be very different meaning to it as well. But it's getting at the same point. I don't know, maybe I'm like talking too much, but you're welcome, Cynthia. But any other questions or comments from tonight? We're a little bit over, but happy to answer if there are any. So again, maybe don't dwell too much in the last little bit. Again, I was just approaching that because it's just somebody throws out, like Cynthia did, a statement. It's important that, again, we maybe look at that statement and pick it apart. And I did come up with a sort of second way of looking at it, which I think would be completely valid as well. But recall again that what we're trying to get at is there is a false appearance that's going on. Nonetheless, phenomena do appear and come into some mode of existence, albeit very slight. But the false appearance indicates, that that's what we have to refute. That's what we have to get at. And this adherence to that grasping at that as real, is what we have to start with, is to stop believing in that, because we refute that through reasoning, through logic. But we don't go so far as to refute its utter existence. Otherwise, again, we'd fall into an extreme of nihilism, which we'll look at as we go through this, and especially next week when we talk about dependent arising. Dependent arising is said to be the ideal reasoning because it skirts right through that middle way, that Madhyamika, between the extremes of thinking things don't exist at all and thinking things have this elevated form of existence that we've been believing in since beginningless time, that we're adhering to, this inherent existence. Okay. That's enough for tonight. Let's go ahead and do some prayers, Bob. If you can put those on the page. Again, we'll do the 2 dedication prayers that we normally do on these Wednesday night classes, dedicating all the merit for the benefit of all sentient beings by dedicating for our own enlightenment. So let's recite that together. Due to the merits of these virtuous actions, may I quickly attain the state of a Guru Buddha and lead all living beings without exception into that enlightened state. And then the next verse pertains to bodhicitta, which again is that method side, but can also be united with our wisdom. But we want to make sure that we grow that mind initially at that level of that strong wish to benefit all beings, to become a Buddha for their sake. And we want it to continue to grow and develop and be united with our wisdom. And we, moreover, want this to happen for all beings, to be motivated in that way. May the supreme jewel bodhicitta that has not arisen arise and grow, and may that which has arisen not diminish, but increase more and more. Then finally, let's do prayers for our precious teachers, realizing that we depend upon these teachers to realize emptiness, to practice the path, to generate bodhicitta. Everything, all of our practice of virtue is dependent upon them. So we make strong prayers for their good health and long lives. The wish-granting, wish-fulfilling jewel, source of every single benefit and happiness in this world, to the incomparably kind Tenzin Gyatso, I beseech, may all your holy wishes be spontaneously fulfilled. Then for Lama Zopa, you who uphold the subduer's moral way, who serve as the bountiful bearer of all, sustaining, preserving, and spreading Manjuna's victorious doctrine, who masterfully accomplish magnificent prayers honoring the 3 jewels, Savior of myself and others, your disciples, please, please live long. And then finally for Osohita Lama Yeshe's reincarnation. Venerable One, to you whose kindness exceeds that of all the conquerors for those wanderers in far-off places, especially the West, mindful of your loving concern for us in intentionally descending again into a family of a far distant land, we make this request. O Lama, please, please live long. And lastly, just dedicate for anyone else that you're holding in your heart who's experiencing difficulties at this time, illness, obstacles, who has died or is dying, and dedicate for their welfare that they may be free from suffering and find true peace and happiness. And may this be so for all beings because of what we've done here tonight. Wonderful. Thank you all so much for joining. It was great being with you again tonight. And again, we'll continue. I probably won't even do as much review at the beginning of next class, though I'll obviously have to get us all back into the topic. But we just want to keep it moving forward and looking at all of this so that you get a good survey of these verses and the different techniques of realizing emptiness. So have a good week, or maybe I'll see you later this week at various other teachings. But take care now. Be well. Be safe. Wear your mask.